Well, let's move on to the second in our 5-pack of videos. This one is about contextualisation, which, as I've said briefly in the first video, is in fact at the heart of being successful in CAP. A technician doesn't care much about the business context, because if you're just doing technical stuff, you don't actually need to know about the business context. You just need to know the details and the numbers. But if you're trying to provide high quality advice that is relevant to the business, then the thing that ought to be central in your mind is, what is the business context in which I'm providing this advice? What is my advice going to be used to do? Getting contextualisation right is essential if you want to pass CAP. The reason that a lot of people fail CAP is because they just don't get the context correct. So this session is about explaining to you a process for doing contextualisation in some detail, so that you ask the right questions and you draw the right information out of the particular case, or in the wider world, the actual business advice that you're being asked to give. Don't regard this process just as central to CAP. It should be central to all of your actuarial career in providing advice to your customers. Why is it essential? Because that's what the business wants you to be able to do, to provide your advice in their context. Not your context, but their context. They need to use that advice then to solve their particular business problem. Context is about us all the time. Everything we do, say, think is all about a particular context. Without the context, you actually don't understand it. Think about language. If I say, I miss them, you actually have no idea what I'm talking about. Let me give you two particular scenarios for that particular phrase, I miss them. I could be a hitman talking to my high-ranked crime figure who says, David, how did you go? And I say, I miss them. And you can imagine the response from the person that hired me. How could you do this? What did you do? Etc. and so forth. That's one context. The other context is, I miss them because some of my grandchildren have just gone to the Philippines on an overseas assignment. I miss them. Same set of words, context gives you an absolutely, totally different meaning each of the time. Unfortunately for actuarial technicians, there's rarely a single correct answer to the questions that we're asked. There's always a spectrum in which we can give an answer that is perfectly justifiable and useful to the business. Now, if you've had any experience, and I suspect most of you have had quite a deal in terms of operating in a business environment, you've always got competing issues in a business. Different parts of the business have different views on what should be done. And as actuaries, we know very well that all of this happens in the context of serious uncertainty about what the future is going to give in terms of our markets, our customers' behaviour and so on. So we've got to understand all business decisions are about competing interests in the context of serious uncertainty. What does the client want to know from us? They want to know, if we make these decisions which you have recommended that we take to solve this business problem, what are the implications that are going to follow from it? That's where our advice should end up. We recommend that to solve this particular issue, you take these decisions, and the implications of doing that will be this. And hopefully the implications are positive. The other thing to remember is that the technical work is not the end of the job. That may have been your experience to date in terms of what the work you've been doing, but it's not the end of the job. It's actually merely the start, the beginning of being able to provide proper actuarial advice. But note the final comment. High quality technical work is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for excellent advice. That's a mathematical construct with which I'm sure you're all familiar. It's a necessary but not a sufficient context for excellent advice. Unfortunately, the client isn't actually interested in the actuarial answer, which is a real disappointment if you take pride in your technical work, which you should do. They want to know, what should I do? What action should I take? Well, what does the results that you have come up with imply for action, and therefore what action have you recommended and why? Now, actuaries are not spin doctors, so we don't necessarily produce the answer that the client wants. And you will find some of the most challenging pieces of advice when you have to give a recommendation which you know in advance the client doesn't want to hear. But that's what we're here for. That's why we claim to be professionals. We will give the client the answer and the recommendations that we believe are appropriate in the situation, even if we know they don't particularly want to hear them. So if contextualisation is so important, how do we actually do it? Well, there's a 5-step process in contextualisation, and it goes like this. We draw the right conclusions, we answer the right question, we do the right analyses with the right assumptions, we provide the advice which addresses the business issue, and we identify the key risks, uncertainties, and some risk management. So let's go through that 5-step process as I draw for you the process on this graphic. As I go through the drawing, you'll understand why I never was going to make a living as an artist. We start with the case, which in the real world, in your life as an actuary, can be what you've been asked to do, the brief from the client, the particular situation, the business issue you're asked to solve. In the case of CAP, it is in fact the CAP exam question or the post-course assignment. We start with the case. And then the first thing we do is we draw the right conclusions. And we start with that. Although there are plenty of other things we want to do, analysis, figuring out what the question is that we're supposed to answer, we always start with drawing the conclusions. Because if you don't draw the right conclusions, the things that you might think are there in the other 4 steps in the process will almost certainly have errors in them. So while this goes round in a circle, as you will see when I finish the graphic, we always start with drawing the right conclusions, which come from the case. So what conclusions do we want to draw? Well, you've heard of WWW, which you think stands for the World Wide Web, but the Actuaries Institute has commandeered WWW for the purposes of the CAP course, and it stands for what, where and who. There are some other things in drawing the conclusions, but these are the 3 essential bits. You get this right, you're well on the way to passing CAP. So what? What's going on? What is it that this case is all about? Now, this is not a 1,000-word essay on it. This is 4 or 5 dot points. What's actually going on? Now, in the next 2 video sessions, we'll actually go through 2 cases, and you will see what I mean by when I say what's going on. What is happening? You're not trying to draw any serious issues out of this, just to understand what it is that is at the centre of the case. Where is it? What does it matter where it is? Well, as you well know, commercial actuarial practice exists in Capland, a country that you have never heard of, but one that by the time you finish the course you will never want to be anywhere else. Capland is a wonderful, magical place for people writing questions for CAP examinations, because we can make it do and have whatever regulations we like. So why do we want to know where it is? Because it will tell you what financial services environment exists for the purposes of the case. If it is not Australia, it is not Australia. And therefore, unless you are specified otherwise, do not assume that the Australian regulations apply. If you're told that they do, that's fine. You may be told that they apply except that they've been changed in this ways, or you may be given 3 or 4 sentences about the regulations that apply. Those are the ones that are important in terms of the case. So where is it? Who is involved? What, where and who? And we've got several parts of who's. We've got organisations and we've got people. In terms of organisation, what are their roles and their relationships? What type of organisation are they? Do they have any views that are expressed in the case? And as you'll see in our examples, they often express views. And what is their risk appetite? Now, if their risk appetite is not specified, then you assume it is the risk appetite for a normal organisation of the type that the case describes. So as we'll see in the banking example, it says it's a large bank, but there's nothing about its risk appetite. Therefore, you would assume that because it's a large bank, it will have the normal risk appetite for a properly managed large bank. What about the people? People have positions and they have views. And whatever you might think of the situation, the fact is the more senior the position, the more important the views are. So if the chief executive expresses a view, that is the view that carries most weight. It doesn't mean you have to accept it, because in fact it may be a view which you want to demonstrate is unreasonable. But if the marketing director and the chief executive have 2 different views, guess which one is likely to play out in the end? Who is the client? Now, mostly this is obvious, but there have been celebrated occasions in the past, particularly in one general insurance case, where the client was not the obvious client, despite the fact that the case made it quite clear who the client was. A number of people failed that case because they addressed their advice to the wrong client. So make sure you ask the question. It may be obvious, but don't miss asking the question. Are there any professional issues? Mostly there aren't, but again, ask the question. If there's a professional issue there, suppose you're asked to comment on some other actuary's advice. That immediately raises a professional issue. How do you do that properly? As I said, mostly they aren't there, but make sure that you ask yourself the question as you go through the case. Are there any conflicts of interest? Again, not terribly often, but ask the question, because if there is a conflict of interest or there is a professional issue that you have missed, you have really given yourself a big negative in terms of being able to pass the question. It may not be fatal, but it sure won't help. And finally, there is usually data provided. The data provided is all that there is. There are no steak knives going with the question. The data is all there is, and you can assume that the data that is provided is sufficient to produce an answer which will pass the question. Don't lament the fact that there isn't other data. What you've got is all that you need, except for things that we expect you to know, like what's a sensible rate of inflation to assume, or what is the current government bond rate that is sensible to assume. We assume you know those things, but otherwise the data that's provided is all that you need in order to do the question successfully. So we've drawn all the right conclusions. Now, answer the right question. In other words, determine the business issue, because that drives the right question. And the right question is always of this form. What business decision or decisions should I make to resolve the issue? That's the right question. It's always in that sort of form. It may not use those words, but that's what it means. It is not, what is the answer? Actuaries love giving answers, and all your education to date has been substantially about what is the answer. Well, the world has just changed. It's what should I do to solve the problem? So that's the right question. What is the right question? Then we go on to analyses. Before we leave the right question, let's just think about the scope. The scope is always limited to the business issue and your recommendations for its solution. Don't go outside the scope. It's a waste of time, and you may well get things wrong if you go outside the scope. So the right analyses. Now, actuaries love doing analyses. We love data, we love playing around with it, drawing conclusions out of it, which is one of the reasons why people use us to provide advice. But we need to do the right analyses. What analyses are you going to do? What are you going to use the results for? The worst way to approach a CAP case study question is to start doing every analysis that you can think of. In the exam, that will waste your time, and you will find that a good deal of it may in fact not be necessary. So start figuring out in your contextualisation, what analyses am I going to do? And having done them, what am I going to do with the answer? How is the answer, the result of my analysis, going to lead me to recommendations in my advice? Set the right assumptions. Now, I'm assuming in your training to date, you're in fact cross-setting the right assumptions, but think about them. Remember, the assumptions that you need to set principally come from the data that you have been provided with, apart from things like inflation rate and so on, which we assume that you will know. Always take the step, what will the future environment look like? And if it's going to change, which the question may imply or state explicitly, what's that going to do to the past experience in terms of the future? And then, of course, do the analysis. And then we come down to provide the right advice. Now, we've already worked out the business question. Up here, the business issue, the business question, the right advice addresses that business issue. As we've said before, the client is not particularly interested in the actuarial answer. They want to know, what should I do? Don't tell the client to think about this. The client has asked you for a recommendation, a specific recommendation for action. So what does your result of all your analyses and your work imply in respect to business decision making? You need to recommend business decisions. And of course, you're not going to produce spin that just gives the client the answer they want. It's very difficult sometimes to give the client the answer that they do not want to hear, but you don't have a choice. If you're an actuary, you need to give the answer that your analyses and the business issue leads you to give. And finally, as the Code of Conduct makes very clear, we need to talk about risks and uncertainties. Focus only on the important risks, the one that arise out of your recommendations. If the client adopts your recommendations, what are the key essential risks that follow from those recommendations? Forget about a long list of risks. It just annoys examiners and it annoys clients unbelievably. I had an experience quite some years ago where in fact I asked a respected firm to provide me some risk analysis and management recommendations for the business that I was the chief executive of. I got the most useless risk list that I have ever seen. It was so bad I refused to pay them. I was the chief executive. They told me that I had risks that the toilet door might come off its hinges. I kid you not. We had a serious argument and I said, forget, if you think you're going to get paid for this, don't bother me. So please don't do anything like that in CAP, even if you're not likely to recommend that the toilet door is a serious risk. What is the likelihood of the risk occurring? And what is the impact if it does? But what is the most important risk of all? Which you don't actually need to mention in your answer, but you should always be aware of. The most important risk in all actuarial advice is our unreasonable belief that our assumptions are actually always right. That seriously is an important risk. Don't ever believe your assumptions are right. If they turn out to be right, good luck. But be aware that in fact your assumptions are always likely to be wrong. Risk advice and actuarial judgment. Just because there's risk doesn't mean the answer is no. If there were no risks, there would be no business. And remember, it's the client's risk appetite that's important, not yours as the actuary. It's the client's risk appetite, which is why earlier in the Draw the Right Conclusions, we talked about here the client's risk appetite. That's the thing that drives it. And that, of course, comes from a good piece of contextualisation. So, here is a process in 5 steps which will enable you to do contextualisation. Draw the right conclusions. Answer the right question. Do the right analysis. Provide the advice which addresses the business issue, and focus only on the key and important risks and how they should be managed, and mention the uncertainties. It's very difficult to manage uncertainties, but you can manage risks. Before you go on to have a look at sessions C and D, where I'll go through 2 examples as to how a really good piece of contextualisation would work, have a go yourselves at each of the 2 examples before you look at the video with the answer. No one ever learned anything by looking at the answer before you have a go at it. So try both of those examples using this 5-step process, and you will get an awful lot of learning out of it. Then come back to the videos on those 2 and see what a good contextualisation differs from the one that you produced.